The morning sun glinted off the polished aluminum fuselage of the Douglas DC-6, its four propeller engines gleaming like promises of the future. At Idlewild Airport in New York, a crowd gathered beneath the departure board, their eyes fixed on a single line: Pan American Flight 914 to Miami. Scheduled departure 9:00 a.m. Captain James Donovan stood on the tarmac, his uniform crisp despite the July heat, conducting his pre-flight inspection with the precision of a man who'd flown combat missions over Europe just 7 years prior. His co-pilot, Michael Richardson, a young Korean War veteran with eager eyes and steady hands, completed the checklist inside the cockpit. Behind them, flight attendants Dorothy Hayes and Susan Miller ensured the cabin was immaculate, each seat cushion perfectly positioned, each emergency card tucked into its pocket. The passengers began boarding at 8:45 a.m. First came the Hendersons, Edward and Martha, married 32 years, traveling to Miami Beach for their anniversary. Edward wore a gray suit with a fedora, Martha a powder blue dress with white gloves. They settled into seats 4A and 4B, Martha immediately retrieving her knitting from a carpet bag. Behind them, businessman Thomas Bradford carried a leather briefcase containing contracts that would, he believed, secure his company's expansion into the Florida market. He was 43, sharp-featured with slicked-back hair and the confident stride of a man accustomed to first-class accommodations. Young Robert Chen, 24, a Chinese-American medical student at Columbia University, found his seat near the rear. He clutched a well-worn anatomy textbook, determined to study during the flight. His parents had sacrificed everything to send him to medical school, and he wouldn't waste a moment. Sarah Morrison boarded with her 6-year-old daughter, Emily. Sarah's husband had died at Normandy, and she was moving to Miami to start fresh, to leave behind the Brooklyn apartment filled with memories of a man who would never return. Emily carried a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers and pressed her face against the window, enchanted by the massive propellers. Father Patrick O'Brien, 62, took a window seat in the middle section. The Catholic priest was traveling to officiate at his nephew's wedding, his weathered Bible tucked under his arm. He nodded politely to the other passengers, his Irish accent still thick despite 4 decades in America. Also aboard were Helen Kozlowski, a nurse relocating to Miami General Hospital, twins Arthur and Albert Russo, jazz musicians heading to a gig at the Fontainebleau, Margaret Chen, no relation to Robert, a stenographer visiting her sister, James Cooper, a traveling salesman, the recently married couple William and Grace Turner, elderly Flora Stevens, traveling to see her first grandchild, and several others, 57 souls in total, including the 4 crew members. At 9:03 a.m., Captain Donovan's voice crackled through the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Pan American Flight 914 to Miami. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 12,000 feet with clear skies all the way. Flight time approximately 3 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." The engines roared to life, one after another, their propellers spinning into invisible discs. The DC-6 taxied to the runway, its shadow sliding across the concrete like a promise. At 9:15 a.m., the aircraft accelerated, lifted its nose, and climbed into the brilliant summer sky. Below, New York sprawled in shades of gray and green, the city already sweltering in what would become one of the hottest summers on record. Inside the cabin, normalcy reigned. Dorothy and Susan served coffee and orange juice. Martha Henderson's knitting needles clicked rhythmically. Thomas Bradford reviewed his contracts. Robert Chen highlighted passages in his textbook. Emily Morrison pressed her face against the window, watching clouds drift past like cotton islands. Father O'Brien read his Bible silently. 20 minutes into the flight, they crossed into New Jersey airspace. The morning was flawless. Visibility unlimited, no turbulence, temperatures perfect. Captain Donovan and co-pilot Richardson exchanged satisfied glances. It was the kind of flight that reminded them why they loved their job. At 9:47 a.m., everything changed. It began with a shimmer. Later, none of the passengers would be able to adequately describe what they saw. Some said the air outside the windows seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. Others described a brief sensation of pressure in their ears, as though the plane had suddenly climbed several thousand feet. A few noticed a peculiar quality to the light. For just a moment, everything seemed to glow with an otherworldly phosphorescence. In the cockpit, Richardson frowned at his instruments. "Jim, are you seeing this?" The altimeter was spinning. The compass rotated wildly. The artificial horizon tilted at impossible angles. Yet the plane flew straight and level, perfectly stable. "Radio's dead," Donovan said, tapping the communications panel. Static hissed, then fell silent. "Jacksonville Center, this is Pan Am 914, do you read?" "Nothing." "New York Center, Pan Am 914, over." Silence. "What the hell?" Richardson reached for the backup radio. Also dead. In the cabin, no one noticed anything unusual. The shimmer had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Some passengers blinked, wondering if they'd briefly dozed. Others didn't register it at all. Dorothy Hayes stepped into the cockpit. "Captain, is everything all right?" "I thought I felt." "We're fine, Dorothy. Just a little turbulence." Donovan forced a smile. "How are the passengers?" "Perfectly content." Mrs. Henderson asked if we have any tea instead of coffee. "Take care of her, would you? We'll be in Miami before you know it." But Donovan didn't believe his own words. Every instrument had returned to normal function, yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The quality of the air had changed. The light streaming through the cockpit windows seemed different, not in any way he could articulate, but different nonetheless. They flew on. The passengers continued their activities. The Russo twins hummed jazz melodies. Margaret Chen wrote a letter to her sister. William Turner held his wife's hand, both of them dozing contentedly. The hours passed with the mundane comfort of routine air travel. At what should have been 12:15 p.m., Miami arrival time, Donovan and Richardson stared ahead in confusion. No coastline appeared. No Florida peninsula stretched below. Instead, endless clouds blanketed the view in every direction, an unbroken white expanse that revealed nothing of the earth beneath. "We should have reached Miami 20 minutes ago," Richardson said quietly. Donovan checked the fuel gauges. 3/4 full. Impossible. They should have burned much more. "Get me Jacksonville on the radio, any frequency." Richardson cycled through every channel. Static. Silence. Static. Silence. "We need to descend," Donovan decided. "Get below this cloud layer. Figure out where we are." "What do I tell the passengers?" "Tell them we're making an early descent due to wind conditions. Keep them calm." Susan Miller's voice came over the intercom moments later, cheerful and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has begun our descent into the Miami area. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The DC-6 dropped through the clouds, and when they emerged beneath the overcast layer, both pilots gasped. Below them sprawled a landscape they didn't recognize, where Miami should have been, with its Art Deco hotels, its wide beaches, its modest skyline. Instead rose an enormous, gleaming metropolis. Skyscrapers of glass and steel stabbed into the sky, some impossibly tall, connected by elevated roadways that seemed to float in midair. The city stretched for miles, far larger than any city either pilot had ever seen. "That's not Miami," Richardson whispered. "That's not anywhere," Donovan replied. They circled, descending further. The beaches were there, recognizable strips of white sand, but everything else was wrong. Massive port facilities, enormous bridges, and the traffic below. The vehicles moved in organized streams, but they looked strange, aerodynamic, nothing like the boxy cars of 1952. "Jim, I think we should—" A voice crackled through the radio, making both men jump. "Unidentified aircraft, this is Miami International Airport Control. You are entering restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately." Donovan grabbed the microphone. "Miami Tower, this is Pan American Flight 914 from New York Idlewild to Miami. We've lost our navigation. Request landing instructions." A long pause. Then, "Say again your call sign." "Pan American Flight 914. DC-6 aircraft. 57 souls on board, 3 hours fuel remaining." Another pause. Longer this time. Multiple voices conferring in the background. Finally, "Pan Am 914, squawk 7700 and maintain current heading. We're going to guide you in." "Roger, Miami Tower, squawking 7700. Donovan exchanged a glance with Richardson. 7700 was the emergency transponder code. "They sound confused." "Everyone sounds confused," Richardson muttered. The radio crackled again. "Pan Am 914, can you confirm your departure point and time?" New York Idlewild departed 9:15 a.m. local time, July 2, 1952. The silence that followed stretched so long, Donovan thought they'd lost contact. Then, "Pan Am 914, continue approach. Follow our vectors. We'll talk more on the ground." They descended through 3,000 feet. The airport came into view and both pilots stared in disbelief. Where Miami International should have been, a modest facility with 2 runways. Instead sprawled an enormous complex with at least 6 runways, multiple terminals and aircraft everywhere. But these weren't aircraft they recognized. Sleek, massive machines with swept wings and no visible propellers. Jets perhaps, but far larger and more advanced than anything they'd seen in military service. Pan Am 914, you're cleared to land runway 09. Emergency equipment is standing by as a precaution. Roger, cleared to land 09. In the cabin, passengers pressed against windows, murmuring in confusion. This didn't look like the Miami they knew. Where were the familiar hotels? Why were the buildings so tall? What were those enormous flying machines? Sarah Morrison clutched Emily close. Mommy, where are we? Miami, sweetheart, just a different part than we expected. Thomas Bradford stood, despite the seatbelt sign. This isn't Miami, he announced loudly. Something's very wrong. Please sit down, sir, Dorothy Hayes said firmly, guiding him back to his seat. We're landing now. The DC-6 touched down smoothly at 12:43 p.m. By the cockpit chronometer, Captain Donovan had made thousands of landings, but never one where his hands shook on the controls. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles followed them down the taxiway, a procession of vehicles that looked nothing like the equipment from 1952. Pan Am 914, taxi to the far end of the field, away from the terminals. Marshals will guide you. Roger. They were directed to an isolated section of tarmac, far from the main airport activity. As the engines shut down, the passengers stirred restlessly. Through the windows, they could see dozens of vehicles surrounding them. Police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, and several black vans with no markings. Men in uniform emerged, but their uniforms were wrong. Modern, synthetic-looking, nothing like the wool and cotton of 1952. Father O'Brien made the sign of the cross. Mother Mary, pray for us, he whispered. The door opened. A stairway was pushed to the aircraft, a motorized stairway that moved by itself, with no one pushing it. Dorothy Hayes descended first, then Captain Donovan. At the bottom waited a man in a dark suit, flanked by security personnel with strange compact weapons. Captain Donovan? The man asked. Yes. What the hell is going on? Where are we? The man hesitated. You're in Miami, Captain. Miami International Airport. He paused, seeming to gather courage. Captain, I need to ask you something. What year do you think it is? Donovan stared. What kind of question is that? It's 1952. July 2nd, 1952. The man's face paled. He glanced at his colleagues, then back to Donovan. Captain, I'm Agent Marcus Webb with the Federal Aviation Administration. I don't know how to tell you this, but he took a deep breath. Today is July 2nd, 2003. You've been missing for 51 years. Behind them, passengers began descending the stairs, blinking in the brilliant sunshine of a world they didn't recognize, a world that had moved on without them, while they'd spent what felt like 3 hours suspended in an impossible moment between then and now. Martha Henderson clutched her husband's arm, her knitting forgotten. Edward, she whispered, staring at the vehicles, the distant glass towers, the people with their strange clothes and devices. Edward, what's happened to us? He had no answer. No one did. They were taken in groups to a secure facility within the airport complex, a building that, from the outside, resembled a large hangar but inside had been hastily converted into a reception center. Medical personnel waited along with government officials, psychiatrists, historians, and a growing crowd of observers, whose very presence seemed to confirm the impossible claim. The year was 2003. The passengers sat in folding chairs arranged in rows, shell-shocked and silent. Some wept. Others stared blankly ahead. A few demanded answers in voices that echoed off the metal walls. Captain Donovan stood with Agent Webb near the front, while co-pilot Richardson sat with his head in his hands, unable to process what he was being told. I need you to understand, Webb said quietly, addressing the group. We're still trying to understand this ourselves. According to our records, Pan American Flight 914 disappeared from radar at approximately 9:47 a.m. on July 2nd, 1952, somewhere over North Carolina. The plane was never found. No wreckage, no debris, no bodies. It became one of aviation's greatest mysteries. And now, 51 years later, you've appeared on our radar exactly where you vanished, as if no time has passed for you at all. That's impossible, Thomas Bradford insisted, his voice sharp. We've been in the air for less than 4 hours. My watch says 1:15 p.m. Our clocks say the same. We can't have lost 51 years in 3 hours. Your watches and clocks continue to measure time as you experienced it, a woman in a white coat explained. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Huang, a physicist from MIT brought in to consult. But somehow, you were removed from the normal flow of time. While you experienced approximately 3 hours, the external world continued for 51 years. Emily Morrison started crying. Sarah held her daughter close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. Father O'Brien led a group in prayer, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. The Russo twins sat together, silent for the first time since boarding, staring at a television screen mounted on the wall showing CNN, a concept they didn't understand, watching images of a world transformed. "My daughter," Martha Henderson said suddenly. "Patricia. She was 8 years old when we left. If this is really 2003, she'd be..." Her voice broke. 59 years old. Older than I am now. Agent Webb nodded gravely. "We're in the process of locating family members. But you need to prepare yourselves. Most of your loved ones believed you dead. They held funerals. They mourned. They moved on with their lives. And they're now 51 years older than you remember them." Robert Chen stood abruptly. "This is insane. Insane. I have medical school exams next week. I have a life. I can't have lost 51 years. "You haven't aged," Dr. Huang said. "None of you have. Whatever happened, you were preserved exactly as you were in 1952. Your bodies didn't experience those 51 years. To you, they never happened." "Then send us back," Helen Kozlowski demanded. The nurse's practical mind grasped for solutions. "If we came forward through time, send us back the same way." "We don't know how it happened," Webb admitted. "We don't even know if it's possible to reverse it." Over the next several hours, teams of specialists interviewed each passenger individually, documenting their experiences, collecting every detail of the flight. Medical examinations revealed impossible truths. The passengers' physical conditions matched their stated ages exactly. Martha Henderson's blood work showed the physiology of a 54-year-old woman from 1952, complete with levels of now eliminated atmospheric pollutants, trace amounts of chemicals no longer in use, and antibodies to disease strains that had long since evolved. They were authentic, impossibly undeniably authentic time travelers. By evening, the facility had transformed into a surreal refugee camp. The government provided meals, food that tasted strange to palates accustomed to 1952 cuisine. Someone brought in cots. The passengers huddled in small groups, trying to comfort each other while processing the incomprehensible. Captain Donovan sat with Dorothy Hayes and Susan Miller, the three of them still in their Pan Am uniforms, discussing practicalities in quiet voices. "Pan American doesn't exist anymore," Dorothy said, having been told by one of the officials. "The company went bankrupt in 1991. We don't even work for an airline that still exists. Everything we knew is gone," Susan whispered. "Our homes, our jobs, our lives. How do we even begin to adapt to this?" Donovan had no answer. He'd survived World War II, had flown through flak and fighter attacks, had seen friends die, but nothing had prepared him for this. To be a ghost, displaced in time, made obsolete by history. The next morning, they were allowed access to newspapers, magazines, and supervised internet sessions. Though most couldn't comprehend what the internet was, they learned of the Cold War's end, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the moon landing, 9/11, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, technologies beyond imagination, cell phones, personal computers, GPS, the pictures of Earth from space, medical advances that had eradicated diseases they'd feared, social changes that shocked their 1952 sensibilities. "Segregation is illegal," Robert Chen said, reading with wonder. "The Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. They actually did it." James Cooper, the traveling salesman who'd grown up in Mississippi, stared at photographs of integrated schools, interracial couples, a black Secretary of State. His worldview, his assumptions, everything he'd believed about the natural order was revealed as temporary, mutable, wrong. Family reunions began that afternoon. Martha and Edward Henderson sat in a small room, holding hands, waiting. The door opened. A woman entered, elderly, gray-haired, leaning on a cane. Her eyes, though aged, were unmistakable. "Patricia?" Martha whispered. "Mom?" The woman's voice cracked. "Dad?" They stood, staring across a gulf wider than space, wider than time. Patricia Henderson was 59 years old. Her mother was 54. The natural order had reversed. "I mourned you," Patricia said, tears streaming down her aged face. "For 51 years I mourned you. I'm a grandmother now. My children have children. And you're younger than I am. You're younger than my daughter." Martha opened her arms. Patricia fell into them and they wept together. Mother and daughter, child and elder, time's victims embracing across an impossible divide. Similar scenes played out throughout the facility. Some reunions were joyful, others heartbreaking. William Turner learned his parents had died 20 years ago. His younger brother was now in his 70s, a stranger with his brother's eyes. Grace Turner's sister had Alzheimer's, couldn't recognize her, thought she was a ghost or a hallucination. Sarah Morrison's reunion was perhaps the most bittersweet. Her sister arrived with a young man in his 20s. "Sarah, this is James, your son." Sarah stared. "James? But I don't have a son." "You were pregnant when you boarded that plane," her sister said gently. 3 months along. You didn't know yet. I raised him. I told him about you, about his father who died at Normandy, about his mother who disappeared, and now he can meet you. But you're 31 and he's 27. The young man stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "Mom?" Sarah took her son into her arms, holding the child she'd never known she carried, now grown into a man 4 years younger than she appeared, and wept for the life they'd both lost. Not all passengers had anyone left to find them. Several had no surviving family members. They sat alone, watching others reunite, feeling the weight of their isolation in this strange new century. Father O'Brien learned that his church had changed dramatically. Vatican II had reformed Catholic Mass, introducing vernacular language, modernizing practices. The priest he'd known, conservative, Latin, traditional, barely existed anymore. His nephew, for whose wedding he'd been traveling, had died in Vietnam 35 years ago. Thomas Bradford's company had dissolved in the 1970s. His wife had remarried, had other children, died in 1998. His business empire, the contracts he'd carried so carefully, were historical footnotes. He sat alone in a corner, holding his briefcase, the contents worthless, his life's work erased. On the third day, Dr. Huang gathered the passengers to explain what scientists theorized had happened. She stood before a whiteboard covered in equations that meant nothing to her audience, trying to make the impossible comprehensible. "We believe you encountered what theoretical physicists call a closed time-like curve, essentially a fold in space-time. Think of it as a wrinkle in the fabric of reality. You entered this wrinkle at 9:47 a.m. in 1952, and you exited it at approximately the same moment in 2003. But for you, only 3 hours passed. You were, in effect, removed from the timeline. Can we go back?" This from Arthur Russo, one of the jazz musician twins. "Can you send us back through this wrinkle?" Dr. Huang's expression was pained. "We don't know how to create such a phenomenon. We don't even fully understand how you encountered it. The energy requirements would be astronomical. And even if we could, we don't know where or when you'd emerge. You might end up in 1952 or 1492 or 2 million years in the future. The mathematics suggest it's not controllable. So we're trapped here," Helen Kozlowski said flatly. "You're home," Webb corrected. "Just 51 years later than expected." Over the following weeks, the impossible task of integration began. The government provided support, financial assistance, housing, counseling. Organizations emerged to help the temporal refugees, as the media dubbed them, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of life in 2003. Some adapted better than others. Robert Chen, the medical student, discovered that his field had advanced beyond his comprehension. MRI machines, laparoscopic surgery, genetic therapy. He would need years of study to practice medicine in this era. But his youth and education gave him advantages others lacked. He enrolled in community college, determined to catch up, to understand this new world, to reclaim his dream. The Henderson family moved in with their daughter Patricia and her family in Tampa. It was awkward, painful, beautiful. Martha learned to use a computer, to watch television with 100 channels, to navigate a world where a phone could fit in your pocket. Edward struggled more, overwhelmed by the pace of change, retreating into silence. But at dinner each night, 3 generations sat together, trying to bridge the temporal divide. Captain Donovan and his crew found themselves celebrities and anachronisms simultaneously. Aviation museums wanted their uniforms. Historians wanted their stories. But no airline would hire a pilot whose last flight was in 1952, whose understanding of aviation predated jet engines and radar. Donovan took a job as a consultant, helping museums restore vintage aircraft, surrounded by relics of his era, a living relic himself. Sarah Morrison struggled most. Her son James helped her find an apartment, taught her about the modern world, introduced her to her grandchildren, children older than she appeared. But the weight of lost time crushed her. She'd missed her son's entire childhood, his first words, his first steps, his graduation, his wedding. She was younger than her grandchildren. The absurdity of it drove her to therapy, to medication, to long sleepless nights staring at a world she didn't recognize. Emily, now 57 years old chronologically but still 6 physically, became the subject of intense psychological study. How do you tell a 6-year-old that she's technically a senior citizen? How do you educate her alongside actual children while she carries memories of a vanished world? The decisions were agonizing, the solutions imperfect. Father O'Brien found unexpected peace. After initial shock, he embraced his situation as divine providence. Perhaps God had a purpose in bringing him to this time. He began working with homeless populations, finding that compassion and faith transcended temporal displacement. The church assigned him to a parish in Little Havana, where he learned Spanish, celebrated modern Mass, and found meaning in service. Thomas Bradford never recovered. The businessman who'd boarded the flight with such confidence, such certainty about his future, found himself in a world where his skills were obsolete, his connections long dead, his entire identity erased. 6 months after arriving in 2003, he was found in a Tampa hotel room, having taken his own life. His suicide note was brief. "I don't belong in this tomorrow. I belonged in yesterday." His death shattered the group. They'd been through something impossible together, bound by shared trauma and displacement. Thomas was the first to surrender to it, but they all felt the weight of his despair. It could have been any of them. The media attention was relentless. Documentaries, news specials, talk show appearances. Scientists studied them. Aviation enthusiasts idolized them. Conspiracy theorists claimed they were government experiments or alien abductees. The passengers became symbols of humanity's relationship with time, progress, and change. A year after their arrival, the survivors gathered for a memorial service for Thomas Bradford. 49 passengers attended. 53 had survived the temporal displacement, but 4 had died in the intervening year, unable to adapt, unable to continue in a world that had moved on without them. They stood in a cemetery in Miami, under a sky that looked the same as the sky they'd known in 1952, reading from a Bible that contained the same words Father O'Brien had read on the plane. Some things didn't change. Some things transcended time. "We are strangers in a strange land," Father O'Brien said, his Irish accent still thick, his hands still steady. "But we are not alone. We have each other, and we have the most precious gift anyone can receive. More time to live, to love, to grow, to forgive, to understand." Thomas couldn't see that. The tragedy is that he focused on what was lost, rather than what remained. Let us honor him by choosing differently. 3 years after Pan American Flight 914 landed in a world that had aged 51 years in 3 hours, the survivors had scattered across America, each finding their own path through the labyrinth of temporal displacement. Some thrived, others merely survived. All carried the weight of being living contradictions, old souls in young bodies, veterans of a vanished world navigating an incomprehensible present. Robert Chen stood in the emergency room of Boston General Hospital, wearing scrubs, a stethoscope around his neck, finally a doctor. It had taken him 5 years of intensive study, accelerated courses, catch-up education, modern medical training. He was 34 chronologically, 29 physically, but his eyes held the peculiar mixture of youth and age that marked all the temporal refugees. He sutured a laceration on a teenager's arm, his hands steady, his mind focused. The techniques were different from what he'd learned in 1952, but the fundamental principle remained: heal the wounded, ease suffering, preserve life. When he finished and the grateful family left, he stepped into the break room and collapsed onto a worn couch. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, his colleague and friend, sat beside him. She knew his story. Everyone did, though most people had stopped treating him like a curiosity by now. "Long shift?" she asked. 36 hours, he said. "But I'm not complaining. You know how long I waited to do this? 54 years, give or take." She smiled. "You've come a long way, Robert. He thought about the scared medical student who'd boarded that plane with anatomy textbooks and dreams. That student still lived inside him but layered over with new knowledge, new experiences, new understanding. We all have, he said quietly. In Tampa, Florida, Martha Henderson sat in her daughter's garden, now her garden too, tending roses in the early morning light. She was 57 years old by birth, 61 chronologically, but her body remained 57, unchanging, preserved by whatever temporal anomaly had stolen and returned them. Patricia, her daughter, was 62, her body showing the honest wear of years lived naturally. They'd developed an unusual relationship, neither quite mother-daughter nor sisters nor friends, but something new, something only they could understand. Patricia's children, Martha's grandchildren, called her Gram Martha, distinguishing her from Grandma Pat. The family had adapted with remarkable grace, though it had taken years. Edward emerged from the house, moving more slowly than he once had. Time, it seemed, was catching up even to those it had tried to preserve. Though his body remained 56, the weight of psychological trauma, the stress of displacement manifested in other ways. He'd had a heart attack the previous year. The doctors said it was unusual for someone his apparent age, but Dr. Huang had explained that temporal displacement didn't grant immunity to stress, grief, or the toll of living outside one's time. "Coffee's ready," he said. Martha rose, kissed his cheek, and they walked inside together, survivors of an impossible journey, still finding small comforts in morning routines that bridged 1952 and 2006. In Brooklyn, New York, Sarah Morrison worked as a teacher's aide at an elementary school, surrounded by children Emily's physical age. Her daughter, now 61 chronologically, 9 physically, attended a special program designed specifically for her unique situation. The psychologist still debated the right approach. Treat her as 9 years old, as 61, acknowledge both. Emily had adapted remarkably well, better than most adults. Children accepted the impossible more easily, asking straightforward questions without the baggage of existential dread. "So you're really old but you look like a kid? Cool. Want to play tetherball?" But Sarah struggled. Her son James was now 30, with children of his own. She was a grandmother who looked younger than her son, an impossibility that drew stares and required constant explanation. Dating was impossible. Who could understand? How do you explain that you're technically 61 but physically 34, with a 61-year-old daughter in a 9-year-old's body? Some evenings she sat alone in her small apartment, looking at photographs. Her wedding to Daniel, 1943. Daniel in uniform, before Normandy. The apartment in Brooklyn where they'd lived. Her sister looking young and vibrant. A world that no longer existed except in memories and history books. She'd joined a support group for the temporal refugees. They met monthly, the survivors who'd been on Flight 9 Mortine, sharing their struggles and victories. The group had shrunk. 43 survivors remained. 10 had died in 5 years, some from natural causes, others from suicide, accidents, or the simple inability to continue fighting time's cruel joke. Captain James Donovan had become a minor celebrity in aviation circles. At 52 physically, 58 chronologically, he'd written a book about his experience. Flying Through Time, The Impossible Journey of Pan Am 914. The advance had provided financial security. He consulted for airlines, helped train pilots in crisis management, and gave lectures about the intersection of aviation and temporal physics. But privately, he wrestled with survivor's guilt. He'd been the captain, responsible for those 57 souls. 10 were now dead, unable to adapt to this future. He'd piloted them safely through space but couldn't navigate them through time. Dorothy Hayes, his flight attendant, had died 2 years earlier. Cancer, the doctor said. But Donovan knew better. She'd died of displacement, of homesickness for a home that existed only in the past. He lived in a modest apartment near SeaTac Airport in Washington, where he could watch planes take off and land, modern jets that would have seemed like science fiction in 1952. Sometimes he dreamed he was back in the cockpit of the DC-6, flying through that shimmer, and in his dreams he could turn the plane around, could fly them back to 1952, could give them their lives back. He always woke before landing. Father Patrick O'Brien, now 72 physically, 68 chronologically, had found genuine contentment in Little Havana's Our Lady of Guadalupe parish. He'd learned Spanish fluently, embraced liberation theology, adapted Catholic practice to serve his community's needs while maintaining his core faith. The church had changed, yes, but so had he. Time had given him perspective, had taught him that doctrine mattered less than compassion, that God spoke in every era's language. He still said Mass, still heard confessions, still offered communion, but he also ran a food bank, organized English classes for immigrants, fought for affordable housing, and marched for social justice. The conservative priest from 1952 had been transformed by temporal displacement into a progressive champion of the marginalized. God sent me here for a reason, he often said. I don't know why, but I trust there is one. In Nashville, Tennessee, the Russo twins, Arthur and Albert, had rediscovered their music. Jazz had evolved dramatically since 1952, but music itself remained universal. They played in clubs, their vintage style now retro cool, their story adding mystique to their performances. They'd adapted their repertoire, learning modern styles while maintaining their roots, becoming bridges between eras through melody and rhythm. They'd reconnected with the jazz community, finding that music transcended temporal displacement. A good improvisation was timeless. A perfect note resonated the same in 1952 or 2006. When they played, they were home. Helen Kozlowski, the nurse, had retrained as a hospice worker. Modern medicine had saved lives that would have been lost in 1952, but death remained inevitable. She found purpose in easing transitions, holding hands, offering comfort. Having passed through time's anomaly, having existed outside the normal flow of life and death, she understood mortality differently. She didn't fear it. She saw it as another transition, another journey into the unknown. The others found their own paths. Some succeeded, some struggled. All bore the mark of their impossible journey, the knowledge that time was stranger than humanity had ever imagined, that reality contained cracks through which one could slip from one decade to another, that the past and future weren't as separate as everyone believed. In 2006, Dr. Patricia Huang published her comprehensive study, The Pan Am 914 Phenomenon, Temporal Displacement and Closed Time-like Curves. It became a landmark in theoretical physics, though it raised more questions than it answered. How had it happened? Could it happen again? Were there others, lost in time's currents, waiting to emerge? She concluded with a sobering observation. The survivors of Flight 914 have taught us that time is not the rigid framework we assumed. It bends, folds, creates pockets where decades can pass in hours. But they've also taught us about resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to survive the impossible. They are pioneers in a frontier we barely understand, and their journey continues. That same year, the survivors gathered in Miami for their annual reunion, marking the 4th anniversary of their arrival in 2003. 43 souls, bound by shared impossibility, met at a hotel near the airport, sharing stories, supporting each other, remembering those who'd been lost. Robert Chen stood to speak. I've been thinking about what Thomas Bradford wrote in his suicide note. I belonged in yesterday. I understand how he felt. We all do. There are days when this world feels alien, when I ache for the Brooklyn streets I knew, the music we danced to, the simplicity of life before computers and cell phones and CNN. He paused, looking at his fellow survivors. But here's what I've learned. Yesterday is gone for everyone, not just us. The people born in 1952 can't go back either. They just experience the journey forward one day at a time instead of all at once. We're not different from everyone else. We're just more aware of time's passage, more conscious of change, more amazed by how far humanity can come in 5 decades. We didn't belong in yesterday, he continued. We belonged in our lives, and our lives continued, just in a way none of us expected. Martha Henderson stood next. My daughter is older than me now. My great-grandchildren call me Young Graham. I bake cookies using recipes my mother taught me in 1935. And my grandchildren Google them on their iPhones to post on something called Instagram. She smiled. It's absurd, it's impossible, and it's my life. And I've decided to love it because the alternative is to die of nostalgia for a world that existed but no longer does. One by one they shared their stories, triumphs and failures, adaptations and resistances, the ways they'd found to bridge the temporal divide, to be simultaneously of 1952 and 2006. To carry their past while living in the present. Father O'Brien closed the gathering with a prayer, his Irish accent still thick, his faith unshaken. Lord, We are your servants, displaced in time but not in purpose. We thank you for the gift of more life, for the opportunity to see tomorrow, for the chance to witness humanity's progress and growing pains. We remember those we've lost, both in the past we left behind and the years since our return. Grant us strength to continue, wisdom to adapt, and grace to find meaning in this impossible journey. Amen. Amen. 43 voices echoed. That evening, several survivors stood on Miami Beach, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The beach looked nothing like it had in 1952, more crowded, more developed, lined with hotels that reached toward the sky. But the ocean remained the same, timeless, indifferent to human temporal dramas. Sarah Morrison stood with her son James, his arm around her shoulders in a reversal of natural order. Emily played in the surf with James's children, her grandchildren, laughing with the unself-conscious joy that only children possess. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" James asked. Sarah thought about it, really thought about it. "I wish I'd known I was pregnant when I boarded that plane. I wish I'd gotten to raise you, to see your first steps, to help with your homework, to meet your wife before the wedding. I wish for all the moments we lost." She paused, watching Emily chase the waves. "But if I went back, I wouldn't know you now. I wouldn't know Emily as she is now. I wouldn't have experienced this strange, impossible life. And as much as it hurts, as disorienting as it is, this is my life now. I can't go back. None of us can. So I have to go forward." Captain Donovan stood apart from the group, his pilot's eyes scanning the horizon, always watching for the next destination. Co-pilot Michael Richardson approached, the two men sharing a comfortable silence before Donovan spoke. "You know what the strangest part is, Mike? In 1952, I thought I'd seen everything. War, combat, friends dying, the best and worst of humanity. I thought there were no more surprises." He laughed quietly. "Turns out the universe had one more trick up its sleeve." "Do you think it'll happen again?" Richardson asked. "To another plane, another group of people?" "I don't know. Dr. Huang says the conditions were probably unique, a 1 in a billion cosmic accident. But the universe is big. Time is long. Maybe it's happened before. Maybe it'll happen again. Maybe there are people from 1850 walking around somewhere, trying to understand smartphones, or people from next year who jumped backward and are living in confusion in 2004. Richardson considered this. "That's a disturbing thought." "All of existence is disturbing when you really think about it," Donovan replied. "We're specks on a rock orbiting a star in a galaxy containing billions of stars in a universe containing billions of galaxies, and somehow we're conscious, aware, able to ask questions about our place in it all. Compared to that, time travel is almost reasonable." They stood together, two pilots who'd flown through an impossible sky and somehow survived the landing, watching the sun sink into the Atlantic Ocean, the same ocean that had existed in 1952 and would exist long after 2006, indifferent and eternal. As darkness fell, the survivors drifted back to their hotels, their homes, their lives in this strange present. They would wake up tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, living forward one moment at a time like everyone else, carrying their unique burden of displacement, their impossible memories, their status as living proof that reality was stranger than anyone imagined. Robert Chen would save lives with medicine that hadn't existed in his youth. Martha Henderson would teach her great-grandchildren recipes from the Great Depression while they taught her to use Facebook. Sarah Morrison would watch Emily grow, the slowest childhood in human history, 9 years old for the 3rd year in a row, preserved and displaced, like all of them. Father O'Brien would offer communion and counsel, faith adapted to new times. The Russo twins would play jazz that bridged decades. Captain Donovan would train a new generation of pilots, teaching them that aviation involved more than flying. It involved trusting instruments when instinct failed, maintaining calm when reality defied expectation. They would live. They would adapt. They would carry their impossible story forward into the future, one day at a time, no longer belonging to 1952 but never quite belonging to 2006 either, existing in the space between, refugees of time, survivors of the impossible, witnesses to humanity's strange journey through the 4th dimension. And sometimes, late at night when they couldn't sleep, they would wonder, what happened in that shimmer at 9:47 a.m. on July the 2nd, 1952? What cosmic circumstance, what fold in space-time, what impossible physics had plucked them from their present and deposited them 51 years hence? Would science ever explain it? Would it ever happen again? The questions had no answers. Perhaps they never would. But the survivors had learned to live with uncertainty, to embrace the mystery, to find meaning not in understanding why, but in choosing how to continue, despite not knowing. They were 57 people who boarded a plane in 1952 and landed in 2003 without noticing any passage of time, and then lived forward from that impossible moment, one impossible day at a time, proving that the human capacity for adaptation exceeded even the universe's capacity for strangeness. The story of Pan American Flight 914 passed into legend, studied by scientists, debated by philosophers, dramatized in films and books. But for those who lived it, it wasn't a story. It was simply their life, stranger than most, harder than many, but ultimately defined by the same struggle everyone faces, to find meaning, connection, and purpose in whatever time you're given, whether that time flows normally or jumps 5 decades in the span of 3 impossible hours. And they did. Imperfectly, painfully, courageously they did. In Miami, in Boston, in Tampa, in Brooklyn, in Nashville, in cities across America and eventually around the world as some survivors emigrated, they built new lives from the wreckage of temporal displacement. They fell in love, sometimes with each other, sometimes with people born decades after they'd first boarded that plane. They had children, complicated family trees that genealogists would puzzle over for generations. They pursued careers, hobbies, passions. They argued about politics in an era they'd never expected to see. They learned to use technology that would have seemed like magic in 1952. They lived, and every July 2nd, wherever they were, whatever they were doing, they paused at 9:47 a.m., remembering the shimmer, the moment reality cracked, the instant their lives split from the normal flow of time. They remembered Dorothy Hayes, Thomas Bradford, and the others who hadn't survived the displacement. They thought about the lives they'd lost, the future that had become past while they weren't looking, and then they continued forward, because that's what survivors do. Because time, whether it flows normally or jumps in impossible leaps, only moves in one direction, ahead. The universe had played an incomprehensible trick on 57 souls aboard Pan American Flight 914. But those souls, those impossible time travelers, those refugees from 1952 living in the 21st century, had responded with resilience, adaptation, and the stubborn human insistence on finding meaning even in meaninglessness, purpose even in chaos, home, even when home existed only in memory and history books. They had boarded a plane expecting a 3-hour flight to Miami. They had gotten instead a 51-year journey to a future they couldn't have imagined. And somehow, impossibly, they had survived the landing and learned to navigate the strange terrain of tomorrow. Their story had no neat ending, because they were still living it, still writing it one day at a time, still proving that the human spirit could adapt to anything, even the impossible, even time itself. And that perhaps was the real miracle of Pan American Flight 914, not that they had traveled through time, but that they had survived it, had continued, had found ways to live and love and hope in a world that had moved on without them. The plane itself sat in the Smithsonian now, preserved behind glass, a Douglas DC-6 that had flown through a crack in reality and returned carrying 57 impossible passengers. People came to see it, to marvel at it, to photograph it. But the real story wasn't the plane, it was the people, 43 of them still living, still adapting, still carrying their unique burden and gift. The knowledge that time was stranger than anyone knew, that reality could bend and break and reconstitute itself, that tomorrow could arrive all at once instead of slowly, and that humanity could survive even that. They were living proof that the impossible was possible, that time could be conquered not by understanding it, but by refusing to let it defeat you, that home wasn't a place or a time, but a choice, a decision to keep living forward no matter how strange forward became. And so they did. Day after impossible day, survivors of the greatest displacement in human history, refugees of time, pioneers of an accidental tomorrow, living testaments to resilience, adaptation, and the strange, beautiful stubbornness of the human spirit in the face of the incomprehensible. Their journey had begun in 1952. It had continued through 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, and beyond. And it would continue still, forward into whatever future awaited, carrying with them the memories of a vanished world and the hard-won wisdom of those who'd learned that time was not the enemy, Displacement was the enemy. Despair was the enemy. The refusal to adapt, to continue, to find meaning in madness, that was the enemy. Time was just the medium through which they'd traveled, strange and incomprehensible, but ultimately just another challenge to overcome, another obstacle to navigate, another impossible thing that became possible through sheer determination to survive. They had been passengers on Pan American Flight 914, but they had become something more. Pioneers of human resilience in the face of temporal chaos, living bridges between eras. Proof that the human capacity to adapt exceeded even the universe's capacity to surprise. And they flew forward, not in a DC-6 but in time itself, navigating by instruments that didn't exist, guided by a determination that transcended eras, landing each day in a tomorrow that became today, surviving each impossible moment, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one day at a time, forever displaced, forever adapting, forever flying forward into the unknown, survivors of time's strangest journey, proof that the impossible was just another challenge to overcome, and that humanity, against all odds, could overcome anything, even time itself.